The stage lights at the Monterey County Fairgrounds had barely cooled. It was June 18th, 1967, and the air still carried the ghost of something no one in that crowd would ever forget. Thousands of people had just watched a 24-year-old guitarist from Seattle set his instrument on fire, coaxing flames from the body of a Fender Stratocaster while kneeling over it like a man performing a ritual he had invented in real time. The footage would become one of the most iconic moments in the history of popular music. Magazines would print the photographs for decades. Filmmakers would replay the sequence in slow motion, narrating it as the birth of a new era. But the real story of that night did not happen on stage. It happened backstage, in a small, quiet room where two musicians from opposite ends of the earth sat across from each other. And one of them said something that the other would carry like a wound for months. Jimi Hendrix walked off the Monterey stage drenched in sweat, his hands trembling, his ears ringing from the volume that had shaken the wooden stage beneath his feet. The crowd was still roaring. People were standing on their chairs. Someone was crying. The air smelled like lighter fluid and burnt lacquer and the particular electricity that fills a space when thousands of human beings collectively realize they have witnessed something unprecedented. His bandmates, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, were already backstage, grinning, buzzing with the adrenaline of a performance that had gone beyond anything they had rehearsed. Crew members slapped Jimmy on the back. Someone handed him a towel. Someone else handed him a drink. Yet the words around him blurred into a wall of congratulations and disbelief. But Jimmy was not celebrating. He never celebrated the way people expected him to. Behind the wild stage persona, behind the burning guitars and the feedback symphonies and the teeth-on-strings theatrics, there was a quieter man. A man who listened more than he spoke. A man who spent hours alone with his instrument, searching for sounds that lived somewhere between thought and feeling, sounds that did not yet have names. The performer the world saw was only one layer of a much deeper architecture, and that deeper architecture was always hungry, always restless, always asking whether the music was good enough, whether the sound was true enough, whether the noise carried meaning or just volume. That hunger is what led him down a narrow corridor behind the main stage, away from the celebration, toward a door that was slightly open. Inside, the room was dim. A single lamp cast warm light across a small space cluttered with instrument cases and folding chairs. And sitting in that room, cross-legged on a cushion someone had placed on the floor, was a man whose relationship with sound was as old as civilization itself. Ravi Shankar had performed earlier that afternoon. His set had been a revelation of a completely different kind. Where Jimmy had unleashed walls of electric fury, Shankar had built cathedrals from silence. His sitar playing at Monterey was not a performance in the Western sense of the word. It was a meditation made audible, a conversation between a musician and the infinite patience of Indian classical tradition, a tradition that measured mastery not in years but in lifetimes. Shankar had been studying music since childhood, trained in the guru-student lineage that demanded decades of discipline before a musician was considered ready to perform publicly. He understood rhythm in cycles that Western musicians had never encountered. He understood melody as a living entity, a raga that carried specific emotional and even spiritual properties depending on the time of day, the season, the intention of the performer. Every note he played was chosen with the precision of a poet selecting a single word from 10,000 possibilities. Shankar was 57 years old that evening. He had spent more than 4 decades refining his art. He had performed for heads of state, collaborated with Western classical orchestras, and was in the process of introducing an entire generation of Western listeners to the depth and sophistication of Indian music. George Harrison of the Beatles had sought him out as a teacher. Classical violinists considered him a peer. He carried the weight of an entire musical tradition on his shoulders, and he carried it with the calm authority of someone who understood that real mastery was not about what you could do, but about what you chose not to do. When Jimmy appeared in the doorway, Shankar looked up. Their eyes met. According to accounts from people who were present in adjacent rooms and heard fragments of what followed, Shankar gestured for Jimi to sit down. The young guitarist entered quietly, almost shyly, the way he always moved when he was not on stage. He sat on a folding chair across from the sitar master and said nothing for a long moment. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that occurs when two people who understand the power of sound also understand the power of its absence. Shankar spoke first. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the gentle authority of a man who had spent his life in the company of sound. According to accounts from that era, he told Jimi that he had heard part of his performance. He had heard the volume, the distortion, the feedback, the sheer sonic force that Jimi had unleashed on the Monterey audience. And then Shankar said something that cut deeper than any critic's review, deeper than any bad notice in any newspaper. He told Jimi that his approach to sound was wasteful, that he was using noise where silence would be more powerful, that true mastery of an instrument meant knowing when not to play, knowing how to make a single note carry the weight of an entire orchestra, knowing that the spaces between sounds were as important as the sounds themselves. The words landed with a force that surprised everyone, most of all, Jimi himself. This was not a jealous competitor trying to diminish a rival. This was not a bitter older musician resenting the success of a younger one. This was a master of sound, perhaps the greatest living master of acoustic sound on the planet, telling Jimi Hendrix that his relationship with his instrument was incomplete. That volume was not power, that distortion was not depth, that the fire he had set on stage was impressive as spectacle, but meaningless as music unless it served something greater than itself. Jimi did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not explain his artistic vision or cite his influences or list the technical innovations he had pioneered. He just listened. And in that listening, something began to shift. Not immediately, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone in that room could have measured or photographed. But a seed was planted in the soil of a mind that was always ready to grow. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Some accounts suggest it was shorter, others longer. The precise words exchanged have never been fully documented because neither man was the type to seek publicity for private moments. But the people who knew Jimi in the weeks and months that followed noticed changes. Subtle at first, then increasingly unmistakable. To understand why Shankar's words hit so hard, you have to understand what Jimi Hendrix was carrying inside him long before Monterey. He was not simply a loud guitarist who liked effects pedals and showmanship. He was a musician who had spent years absorbing every form of American music, from the blues of the Deep South to the rhythm and blues of the Chitlin Circuit, from the jazz he heard on late-night radio to the rock and roll that was reshaping the cultural landscape of the 1960s. Before London, before fame, before the burning guitars and the headband and the legend, there was a young man in Seattle who played guitar obsessively, who listened to records with the focus of a scholar studying ancient texts, who understood instinctively that music was a language with infinite dialects. His time as a sideman, backing artists like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, had taught him discipline, timing, the art of serving someone else's vision. His arrival in London in 1966, brought there by Chas Chandler, the former bassist of The Animals, had unleashed something that discipline had been holding back. In London, Jimi discovered that audiences would accept the full range of his musical imagination, the feedback, the distortion, the controlled chaos that American audiences had not been ready for. The Jimi Hendrix experience with Redding and Mitchell became a vehicle for sonic exploration that had no precedent in popular music. But even at the height of his explosive London success, Jimi carried a quiet insecurity. Biographies and interviews from that period reveal a man who was never fully satisfied with what he produced. He would spend hours in the studio, layering take after take, searching for something he could hear in his mind but could not quite capture on tape. He was a perfectionist operating in a genre that celebrated spontaneity, a deep thinker working in a medium that rewarded spectacle. The gap between what he heard internally and what he could make the external world hear was a source of constant private frustration. So when Ravi Shankar, a musician whose mastery was beyond question, told him that his approach to sound was wasteful, it did not bounce off the armor of fame and success, and it went straight to the place where Jimi's own doubts already lived. It confirmed something he had been afraid to admit to himself, that maybe the volume and the fire and the feedback were sometimes covering for something he had not yet learned. That maybe the most powerful thing a musician could do was not fill every moment with sound, but choose, with surgical precision, which moments deserved sound and which deserved silence. The weeks after Monterey were transformative. Jimi returned to London, then to New York, carrying Shankar's words like a compass pointing toward uncharted territory. Those close to him noticed that his practice sessions changed. He would sit with his Stratocaster unplugged, playing so quietly that the notes were barely audible, as exploring the acoustic properties of the instrument beneath all the electronic architecture he had built around it. He would sustain single notes for minutes at a time, listening to how they decayed, how the overtones shifted as the vibration faded, how the wood of the guitar body colored the sound in ways that amplification usually masked. He began listening to Indian classical music with the same obsessive attention he had once reserved for blues and jazz records. He studied how Shankar and other Indian musicians used silence as a structural element, how a single bent note on a sitar could carry more emotional information than an entire chord progression on a Western instrument. He did not try to imitate Indian music. He was not interested in surface-level borrowing or exotic flavoring. He was interested in the principle underneath, and the idea that restraint could be more powerful than excess, that a musician's relationship with silence was as important as their relationship with sound. The evidence of this transformation appeared gradually in his recordings. Listen carefully to the albums and sessions that followed Monterey, and you can hear a guitarist who is learning to breathe differently. The spaces between notes began to widen. The sustained tones grew longer, more deliberate, carrying more emotional weight per second of sound. The feedback, which had once been a wall of chaos, became more controlled, more purposeful, deployed as a specific color in a larger palette rather than a default texture. But this was not a simple story of a loud musician learning to be quiet. It was far more complex than that. Jimi was not abandoning his approach. He was deepening it, and he was adding new dimensions to a sound that was already revolutionary. The fire was still there. The volume was still there. The distortion and the feedback and the sheer physical force of his playing, all of it remained. But now there were also moments of extraordinary stillness within the storms. Passages where the guitar would fall almost silent, where a single clean note would ring out with the clarity of a bell in an empty cathedral, and the contrast between that silence and the surrounding chaos made both more powerful. This is the paradox that Shankar's criticism unlocked. By telling Jimi he was wasting sound, Shankar did not diminish what Jimi was doing. He expanded it. He gave Jimi permission to explore the other half of music, the half that exists in the spaces between notes, in the breath between phrases, and in the silence that makes sound meaningful. It was as if Jimi had been painting with every color except white, and someone had finally shown him that white was not the absence of color, but the foundation that made all other colors visible. The recording sessions for what would become Electric Ladyland, which began in late 1967 and stretched deep into 1968, show this evolution in vivid detail. The album is often discussed in terms of its technical innovations, its layered production, its groundbreaking use of studio effects. But beneath all the sonic architecture, there is something else happening. There is a guitarist learning to use space, learning to let notes breathe, learning that the most powerful moment in a piece of music is often not the loudest moment, but the moment just before the loudest moment. You're the inhale before the scream. Consider the way certain passages on that album unfold. The guitar will build toward what seems like an inevitable explosion, layers of sound piling on top of each other, tension mounting with each new frequency added to the mix. And then, just when the listener expects the full force of Jimi's electric arsenal, there is a pause, a breath, a moment of near silence where the absence of sound becomes the most dramatic element in the composition. When the sound returns, it returns with 10 times the impact it would have had without that pause. This is the architecture of restraint. This is what Shankar was talking about. Jimi never spoke publicly about the Monterey conversation in explicit detail. He was not the kind of artist who explained his process in interviews. When journalists asked about his influences, he would mention blues musicians, jazz players, sometimes classical composers, but he rarely discussed the specific encounters that shaped his thinking. The Shankar conversation remained a private turning point, known to those in his inner circle but never offered to the public as a narrative. But there are clues scattered throughout interviews and conversations from that period. In one exchange with a journalist in late 1967, Jimi talked about wanting to make music that used silence as an instrument. In another, he described listening to Indian music and being amazed by how much emotion a single note could carry when it was given room to exist. These fragments do not mention Shankar by name, but they point toward the same realization, and the same shift in understanding that began in that quiet room behind the Monterey stage. The people around Jimi noticed the change in ways that went beyond his music. His approach to performance evolved. The early Jimi Hendrix Experience shows were almost exclusively about sonic assault, about overwhelming the audience with volume and visual spectacle, about creating an experience so intense that it bypassed the intellect entirely and went straight to the nervous system. The shows that followed Monterey still had those elements, but they also had moments of unexpected tenderness. Moments where Jimi would stop the sonic barrage and play something so quiet, so gentle, so nakedly beautiful that audiences accustomed to the spectacle would fall silent in surprise. These moments were not accidents. They were deliberate choices made by a musician who had learned that contrast was the most powerful tool in any artist's arsenal. Loud means nothing without quiet. Speed means nothing without slowness. Complexity means nothing without simplicity. Shankar had not told Jimi to stop being Jimi. He had told him to become more fully himself by embracing the full spectrum of what sound could do, including the sound of nothing. The months between Monterey and the completion of Electric Ladyland were among the most creatively intense periods in Jimi's short life. He was working constantly, recording at all hours, experimenting with new techniques, pushing his bandmates and his engineers toward sounds that no one had heard before. But within that intensity, there was a new patience, a willingness to wait for the right note instead of filling every moment with notes, a recognition that the space around a musical idea was as much a part of the composition as the idea itself. This was also the period when Jimi began to talk seriously about building his own recording studio. The vision that would eventually become Electric Lady Studios was driven partly by practical concerns, the desire for unlimited studio time without the pressure of hourly rates, but it was also driven by something deeper. Jimi wanted a space where he could explore sound without the commercial pressures that demanded finished products on a schedule. He wanted a laboratory where the experiments could take as long as they needed to take, where silence could be given the same respect as sound, where the search for the perfect note could continue without interruption. Shankar, for his part, continued his own musical journey with the same disciplined grace that had defined his entire career. He continued to perform, to teach, to bridge the gap between Eastern and Western musical traditions. In interviews from later years, when asked about the younger generation of Western musicians who had been influenced by Indian music, Shankar was generally generous but also cautious. He worried about superficial borrowing, about musicians who used the surface textures of Indian music without understanding the spiritual and theoretical depth underneath. He wanted Western musicians to approach Indian musical traditions with the same respect and seriousness that those traditions demanded of their own practitioners. Whether Shankar ever specifically discussed his Monterey conversation with Jimi in public remains unclear. The accounts that survive come from second-hand sources, from people who were nearby but not in the room, from fragments mentioned in biographies and interviews over the years. What is clear is that the encounter represented a collision between two fundamentally different philosophies of sound, and that the collision produced something greater than either philosophy alone. Jimi Hendrix did not become an Indian classical musician. He did not abandon distortion or feedback or volume. He did not stop setting guitars on fire or playing with his teeth or creating the kind of visceral, physical, almost violent sonic experiences that had made him famous. What he did was incorporate a new dimension into his artistry. Yes, he learned that the most powerful guitarists in the world are not the ones who play the most notes, but the ones who play the right notes at the right moments and leave silence where silence serves the music better than sound. This lesson, planted by Shankar in a quiet room at Monterey, continued to grow and develop throughout the remaining years of Jimi's life. When he performed at Woodstock in August of 1969, the famous rendition of the American national anthem that has become perhaps the most analyzed guitar performance in history, listen to how he uses silence. Between the cascading feedback and the dive-bombing whammy bar and the pure electric screaming that evoked the chaos of war and the pain of a divided nation, there are pauses. Moments where the guitar falls silent and the absence of sound speaks louder than any note could. Those pauses are not accidents. They are the legacy of a conversation between a young rock revolutionary and an ancient musical tradition, mediated by a master who understood that the deepest truths in music live in the spaces where sound is not. By the time of his final recordings in 1970, Jimi was moving toward a musical vision that would have been unrecognizable to the audiences who first saw him in London clubs in 1966. He was talking about recording with orchestras. He was experimenting with longer, more meditative compositions. He was exploring the boundaries between rock, jazz, classical, and what he sometimes simply called the music of the spheres. The perfectionist in him was still unsatisfied, still searching, still hearing sounds in his mind that his hands could not quite reproduce. But the search had changed in character. It was no longer a search for more. It was a search for enough, for the exact right amount of sound in the exact right moment, surrounded by the exact right amount of silence. Ravi Shankar lived until 2012, continuing to perform and teach well into his 9th decade. In the years after Jimi's death in September of 1970, the story of their Monterey encounter became one of many legendary anecdotes circulating through the oral history of rock music. Musicians told it to other musicians. Writers mentioned it in biographies and retrospectives. The details shifted with each retelling, as they always do with stories that pass through many mouths, but the core remained consistent. You, a master of silence, told a master of sound that he was missing half the equation, and the master of sound listened. Perhaps the deepest irony of the encounter is that Shankar's criticism, which could have been received as an insult, instead became a gift. Jimi Hendrix was one of the very few musicians of his generation with the humility and the intelligence to hear criticism from a completely different musical tradition and recognize it not as an attack, but as an invitation. An invitation to grow, an invitation to expand, an invitation to become not just the loudest guitarist in the world, but the most complete. The conversation in that backstage room lasted less than an hour. Its effects lasted forever. Every guitarist who has ever learned to use silence as a weapon, every musician who has understood that restraint amplifies power, every artist who has discovered that what you choose not to do defines you as much as what you do, all of them are, in some small way, inheritors of a lesson that began when Ravi Shankar looked at the young man who had just set his guitar on fire and said, quietly, that fire was not enough. Sometimes the words that change us most are not the words of praise. They are the words that reach into the place where our own doubts live and give those doubts a voice, a direction, a purpose. Ravi Shankar did not diminish Jimi Hendrix that night. He completed him. And in the process, he changed the trajectory of a musical revolution that would echo through every decade that followed. The loudest guitarist in the world learned his most important lesson from a man who understood that the most powerful sound of all is the sound you choose not to make.